So hello everyone, thanks for being patient. My name is Brian Pinn, I work for Metro Blooms. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and celebrating gardening, beautifying our communities, and helping to heal and protect our environment. Namely, what that means is we like to install a lot of rain gardens, teach people about the benefits of stormwater management on their property, protecting water quality, and restoring their land, really just to provide some native habitat as well. Quite a diverse set of things that we offer the public. I'm a landscape designer there, and I've been in the field for probably about 8 years now, between my undergrad and after I graduated with my master's degree in landscape architecture. And so this is what I love to do, so I'm just glad to share it with you guys here tonight. So what I'm going to talk about is rain gardens, but first we're going to talk a little bit about water quality, why rain gardens, design. We're going to talk about how to site your rain garden, how to size it, where to place it, and then I'm going to talk about how to build the rain garden real briefly, and really things to consider as far as troubleshooting goes. And then also get some demonstrations about projects that are in the ground now, and kind of the benefits and why we chose to select them where. Kind of give you guys a breadth of where you can put these, because it really is limited by your creativity essentially. So why rain gardens? Well, they do help protect our lakes, rivers, and streams. And I'll show you later, they protect our oceans as well. And so going back to our 5th grade science class, we have learned that 70% of the earth is water. But the big deal is 3% of that is fresh water, and 90% of that 3% is locked up in glaciers, ice caps, and ground aquifers. So a lot of this really isn't available for our own consumption. You can see that 0.007% is available for drinking and domestic use. And so we really rely on the actual rainfall that comes down to supply our drinking water supply. And so you'll see through this water cycle that a lot of water will infiltrate either through the ground or as runoff across and flow into our lakes and streams. But a lot of the good drinking water is often locked up low in the bedrock, or just above the bedrock in some of the higher soil as groundwater. And so when you look at our land development practices and look at, if we have nothing built on our land, 10% of that rainfall is usually runoff, but we get 25% in shallow infiltration where it soaks into the ground at a shallow level, but we get 25% more that goes really deep into our aquifers, and it's a really slow process to get to that point. But as soon as we start adding houses, we start adding more and more houses in neighborhoods, and we start increasing the density to downtowns and dense urban cores, we lose a lot of that infiltration that you see down here. We only get 10% shallow, 5% deep, and a lot more that is actually shed as runoff over these harder surfaces that we've managed to compact or create as asphalt or rooftops. And so if you look at our traditional method of developing, say, a subdivision, we'll clear everything off and we'll start running big, heavy equipment over it just to make everything really easy to do. And it's all about economics when we build these things, but there's a drawback to this approach where when we bring these through, they compact the heck out of this soil, and this soil can no longer soak up any of this water that falls on the land. And what we do then is put over this, these cute little carpets of, turf grass, and then that acts as green concrete essentially, and it all sheds off of there. And so conventional site design, when you get your home on this nice new subdivision, is it'll hit the roof, hit your gutter, go down, and we'll shoot it out to the street as quick as possible, and we'll never think about it again. But really, what I'm here to do is help us think about that again. And so just to give you the scale, the numbers of the runoff here, say a typical 1,500 square foot house with a patio during a 1-inch rainfall, which is a pretty common rainfall. About 90% of our rains are a 1-inch rain event. You get 925 gallons of runoff just off your house. Add another 617 from your driveway. Add another 3,880 from your, let me explain green concrete. The theory behind this, or not the theory, but our idea behind this is that essentially you can soak up maybe the first 1/8 of an inch of rain in your turf grass, and then the rest of that, once your grass gets saturated, there's nowhere else for that water to go, so that's going to run right off. And so if your soil isn't very porous underneath that, it's going to fill up even quicker and want to run off quicker. So you get a lot of runoff off just this grass area, and this is excluding gardens or anything like that. So but really, when you look at that, it's 5,400 gallons of water just in a 1-inch rain event that are running off your property. And when you look at 30 inches of rain a year like we'd normally get in this area of Minnesota, we have 170,000 gallons of water there. And when the American household uses 127, in theory we have all the water we need right there, but instead we're shooting it out somewhere else and we're paying somebody to take it away, and then we're paying for more to come back. So I'm not saying we're going to drink water out of our rain gardens, but this just kind of put things in perspective. But when you blow this out to the neighborhood scale, I mean, that number increases dramatically right away. And so what it is, it's not really the water that's so much the problem, but it's the water that is the vehicle to transport all these other pollutants down into our rivers. And so you'll see here grass clippings after a fresh mowing, lots of sediment laden in there, a lot of leaf debris, which normally you wouldn't think is a huge deal, but leaf debris is actually one of the hugest contributors to phosphorus in our water, which is the main contributor to algae blooms and everything else that seems to be a problem in our lakes. But with this runoff, here's all the sediment right after a snow melt when you sand the lots, and gunk, which is a technical term, which is essentially, salt, organic matter, oil, heavy metals, and cigarette butts, trash. Really anything can collect in this and get down to our storm drains, and then there we never see it again, unless you're hiking down by the river bottoms and you see these outfalls like this or this. And with all that, this water will wash out and trigger algae blooms. And so increased amounts of runoff laden with these sediments and nutrients will help foster algae blooms. And so it's not necessarily the algae bloom is the biggest issue, but it's when the algae dies, and that's what creates the issue, because there's a lot of oxygen consumed in that process. And so then once all the oxygen is sucked out of the water, that means fish and other things cannot live in that water as easily. And so, and what we get is eutrophication. It creates a eutrophic lake. So a lot of times really shallow lakes are really susceptible to this. Really deep lakes, it takes a longer time to develop this process. But you see here, 1 quart of motor oil can contaminate 250,000 gallons of water. So this adds up really fast when you're just washing the streets. And here's Sunset Pond, and this is right after a rain shower. You can't even see your fingertips at the bottom of that because there's so much debris that's just washed into there. And so really our goal is to, connect you to your local water body and see that this is actually what happens here, and understand why, treating stormwater runoff, whether it's a rain garden or anything else, can be beneficial to our water bodies. Here's Como Lake, and they had this sign here, and it's for fecal coliform because a lot of pet waste and dog parks around the area, and just old street infrastructure that mixes and matches all of your storm sewer and your sanitary sewer, and a lot of this gets to the lake. And this is Powderhorn Lake, where we recently did a project of 120 rain gardens in about 30 days. It was an insane process, but it was a really great process and a community building process. But really what they had here, this is 100 years of just untreated street runoff, and this is what happens. It's just trash, giant algae blooms, and not a lot of stuff lives in this lake. And so again, I'm trying to make the point that we're emotionally and physically connected to our water bodies, and really what I want to show is that is anybody familiar with the concept of a watershed? So essentially, it's a physical boundary where all the water falls on one place and drains to one point. So as you see here, this is the Minnehaha Creek watershed, this bubble right here. And so everything that falls within the Lake Minnetonka area into Minnehaha Creek, there's essentially a ridge that runs on this edge and a ridge that runs on that edge, and everything will flow down essentially to the creek and run straight to the river. And so we've broken out the Twin Cities and the state and the country into various watershed districts, and you can scale this up or down, and these boundaries will still be there. It's pretty infinite. But, and so Bloomington, we have 9 Mile Creek right here. We have the Richfield Bloomington Watershed Management Organization, and we have the Lower Minnesota one. And those are probably the 3 main ones. Plus you have Riley Purgatory Bluff over on the west side of Bloomington there. And so, these are the main watershed districts here. 9 Mile Creek has a great cost share program for anybody who wants to be involved in that. The deadline is approaching fast. I believe it's April 1st or April 5th, something like that. But for homeowners, they offer up to 75% cost share on the installation of a rain garden, which is up to $3,000. I think they're capping for residential. Plus they have commercial ones and institutional ones too. So I advise you to look into that, 9milecreek.org. But blowing back out to this watershed scale, here's the Mississippi river watershed flowing all the way down to the Gulf. And this drains 38 states. And so when you think about all that runoff that comes there and all the agricultural runoff with all the phosphorus and all that flows right down to the Gulf. And what we get is the dead zone in the Gulf. And this is the shore side, and this is the greater Gulf side. And you see, this is just, it's algae laden, there's almost zero oxygen, and there's certain parts of the year that have, it's next to zero oxygen. So it's a brick wall for fish and anything that wants to swim in there. And so it's really important that we try to limit our nutrient loads in the runoff to help not contribute to this so much. And so you'll see that's the dead zone throughout the whole Gulf. Here's Texas, Louisiana, all the way down the board. And this fluctuates with the agricultural season too, which is pretty amazing to watch this in video form, because it blows up to about twice the size in during the spring when there's no plants in the ground, but there's all the fertilizer on the ground. So again, they help protect, rain gardens help protect our lakes, rivers, and streams, and oceans. And so how does a rain garden work? Well, essentially, it's a shallow depression, a flat bottom bowl, where it can receive water in many ways. It can receive water through an underground pipe, which isn't really too easily illustrated here, but say that would come from your downspout and you can bury the pipe, or it can flow over land into the rain garden just over the top of the ground. Or a lot of times, as you see in Bloomington, like off of Thomas Avenue and Old Shakopee Road, there's a bunch of curb cut rain gardens that have been installed where they take water straight off the street. But essentially, it'll collect water for 24 to 48 hours and slowly soak into the ground that way. And the plants will help take up some of that water, but the ground will also help, the plant roots will also help convey it downwards. So this is why we talk about native plants, because native plants have great extensive root systems that help form these conduits down into the ground for the water to soak up. So here's a little illustration of how that would work. And essentially, you get your rainfall. You have a 6-inch deep rain garden here. That's a lot of times typical for a residential garden. But you'll fill up, and it'll soak into where you amended all of this soil, because you want to dig deep and kind of loosen a lot of that soil. And if I have my sound on, you'd hear that the birds are happy now and they're singing. And but that's just kind of a way to illustrate how these work in short. And so, a lot of people ask, why do we use native plants? And really, they provide habitat for wildlife on a limited basis, and they're well adapted to the Minnesota environment. And that's really the big key for, wanting to use native plants or cultivars of those native plants. And so we look at the pre-settlement vegetation map of the Twin Cities. Here's Hennepin County here. We see, a lot of these lighter brown and yellow areas are prairie, oak barrens, hot, dry areas, typically sandier soils. And when you get out towards Lake Minnetonka in the western suburbs, there's a lot more big woods predominantly, and forest soils are a little more clayey, they're a little more dense, and a lot of times, there'd be much different vegetation growing here than here. And so the point I'm trying to get to is when you're looking at your driveway and you see this, it's just blazing hot on the edge of your driveway, you got this black top, it's 100 degrees out there all the time, even when it's 70. Maybe if you're trying to figure out a plant that's gonna survive that area, let's look to the hot prairies. Let's look to what can survive these really hot, harsh environments. Say you have a woody environment in your backyard. Let's look to a lot of plants that grow here. And this is kind of the basis for what we try to do for selecting plants for your rain gardens, depending on where they are in your yard. And so another benefit, I guess, too, is that there's not much of this left. And you'll see these are the native remnant habitats that are left. And it's, 1% probably. And so anytime you can integrate more natives as food and fodder for any butterflies, birds, insects, small mammals, that's all the better. And going back to the root systems, this is 15 feet right here. This is 10 feet. And you see, here's turf grass, and it's about 4 inches deep, the root zones there. But when you get into something like a buffalo grass, that is a very extensive root system. That gets down 5, 6, 7 feet if it's in an environment where it's forced to make its roots go that deep. And so you see that, a lot of these plants like switchgrass, like, purple coneflower, they all average 4, 5, 6, 7 feet. And in a rain garden environment, you can probably expect a mature plant to get pretty close to that depth. So you see the advantage of these root systems, both in helping water get through the soil, but also helping, if you plant them on a slope, they're really great for erosion control because they have really dense root systems. And here's another illustration. Here's turf grass. We get about 3 inches here, and here's a native grass. And you can see these trailing all the way down to about a foot right there. And these are very young grasses that we pulled out here. And so I'll show you a success story before I get into actually siting the garden here. But Burnsville, Minnesota, I don't know how many people are familiar with this neighborhood, but essentially Bar Engineering wanted to do a study back in the 90s about how well do curb cut rain gardens work on a very extensive, in an extensive manner. And so what they did was let's pair up a control watershed and one where we actually install rain gardens, and let's compare the difference between how much water is actually taken up here in these 2 little storm sewer locations. So they would measure how much flow comes at the end of these after every rainfall. And so what we did is in this bottom one here, in the treatment watershed, they installed one at just about every single house. And of course, after the study got done, the last guy who initially refused it said, well, can I get a rain garden now? It's like, well, sorry, the study's over, so if anybody offers you a free rain garden, you take it. And so, but you can see these are pretty extensive, and they're right off the roads here. It's all the green highlighted areas here. And there's also a few where there's a shallow depression running across all the backyards, so they wanted to capture some of that water that goes there before it hits the street. And so what they found, I'll show you an image here before what they found, but here's a before shot and there's an after shot. And so a lot of times they'll have like a small back retaining wall, and they'll have a depressed curb structure where the water will come in and then they'll flow over a little more limestone or something like that, just to kind of slow the flow of the water and capture the sediment. And then this will fill up and drain within 24 to 48 hours. And these are all the way down the block. It creates a really great neighborhood identity here too, if everybody is on board with these. But so what we have here is the green is the one that didn't get rain gardens, and the red is the study area where they actually install the rain gardens. And this is before they installed. So you can see they're pretty much the same as far as how much they peak whenever they get a rain event. And so this is, this is gallons. So this is about 10,000 gallons right there of runoff. And so when you look at after they installed them, look at what that is. I mean, I think it was originally an 85% reduction. After the plant started to mature, it was 90%, 93%, and it peaked about 93% for a few years. They found now, which I don't have to show here, but which is very important for maintenance of these gardens, is that after about 5, 6, 7 years, a lot of the sediment starts to build up in the turf and it blocks the inlet structure. And so you have to go back out there and just lift the turf off and pull the sediment away and lower that again so you can allow water to pass. But they got down to 50% efficiency because water just wasn't getting in there anymore. But now they're getting back up to 80, 90%, which is great. So yeah, 85% volume reduction the first year. And so as you see the block all the way down, they have all these gardens, and like I said, it creates a great neighborhood identity that way. And here's it shows them just building them. And here shows one in action with the water coming off the curb and flowing into the garden and starting to fill up. So, building the rain garden. So let's think about design considerations, some of the main things you want to think about. You want to identify the existing vegetation around there. Are there trees that, like oaks, they're very susceptible to oak wilt, and so you usually don't want to dig around the oak root system too much, otherwise you might trigger something like that. You want to identify, is there just a weedy Siberian elm somewhere that sheds seeds everywhere? Is that going to be a weeding maintenance nightmare 5 years down the road? You want to think about those things a little bit. You want to determine the location of utilities. Call go for one, first and foremost. Know where your utilities are. You don't want to hit a main line. That's not going to be fun. You want to locate all your structures, of course, your house. A big siting consideration is always try to stay at least 10 feet away from your building, especially if you have a basement. You'll notice later in the presentation that there's one built right next to the building, but it's a very sandy area and there's no basement there. So there wasn't really an issue with that. And then, of course, determine your property lines, easements, things like that, because you don't want to, in most cities, as far as I know, you don't want to build rain gardens across property lines, because one person sells, then what are you going to do with that chunk if nobody wants to take care of it? You can receive water from somebody else's property, but you don't want to build a rain garden into their property. And identify any other local ordinances affecting the project, or any cost share opportunities too, which would help out. So basic keys to success: hydrology. How well does your soil infiltrate water? How fast can it soak up that water? And I'll show you guys how to do that in a minute here. soil preparation, you want to over dig your garden, really loosen up, uncompact that soil that's been compacted for so long. And proper plant selection. Is it sunny? Is it dry? Is it wet? Is it hot? Is it shady? And we have a lot of great lists on our website and other publications that we put out that are really easy plant selecting tools. So thinking about the hydrology, thinking about your hills and slopes, what are the water sources? Are you taking water from a downspout from the corner of your house? Are you taking it from a neighboring property where, say everybody's property flows to yours? You got to consider how much water is flowing to this area. What are the high and low points? Identify where things start to concentrate into shallow flow areas. Or is there a swale running through your yard, like a shallow ditch or something like that? Do you have to consider that? And then where is it going after it hits the point where you might want to put a rain garden? Is it still going to go downhill from that point? Are you all of a sudden now redirecting the flow if you insert a rain garden into this flow path? And what is in this? Are there a ton of lawn chemicals? Are there road salts and sediments? A lot of times if you're going to do a curb cut rain garden, especially like in the city of Bloomington, usually the city will kind of help with all the siting, and they'll even help with the plant selection. It's up to you to kind of pick what you want, but they'll give you a list of what to work with a lot of times if you're participating in their curb cut rain garden. But if you're just doing something in your yard, it's however confident you feel there. You can always contact Metro Blooms, you can always contact your watershed district for assistance in this. What are the proper interception points? Like I said, don't put one at the very bottom of a watershed where everything flows to one point right before it hits the sewer sometimes, because a lot of times your yard isn't big enough to handle all of that water. Try to put it up higher so you can limit some of the runoff halfway through the process of it getting to the storm sewer. Locating the garden near downspouts, near driveways. Say your driveway is pitched out this way to the yard. It's a great place to put a really long rain garden right along this whole side here if your driveway slopes to right there, because it will capture all of your driveway runoff. Odds are it usually flows out to the street, but and also, siting a minimum of 10 feet from the foundation is best, especially if you have a basement, and avoiding your utility lines, septic tanks, things like that. And there's things that gopher one won't point out when they come out to mark out. Say you have a little electrical wire running from your garage to your house for a little light out there. Make sure you know where that's at. So sizing the garden for residential yards, if you're staying under 10 by 15, 150 square feet, a lot of times the depth of the bed is more important than your area. And what I like to say is a good rule of thumb, if your soils drain relatively well, you can usually get away with a 6 to 9 inch deep rain garden. That's probably the standard I like to do. And once you get into a foot or anything larger than that, it really limits your plant selection. Most plants can tolerate a 6 inch depth that are proven for rain gardens. And so, like it says here, an average size might be 6 to 10 feet near one downspout, because that's usually about a quarter of your roof, and that's about the size a lot of times for capturing that much water and draining within 24 to 48 hours, because we don't want these to be a mosquito trap. Mosquitoes need 3 days to lay their eggs. They need 7 days to hatch usually. And so if we can get these things to drain, it's actually, you're trapping the mosquitoes. They'll lay their eggs there, and then everything will just die off if you can get it to drain really fast. And so, fit it in your landscaping and your neighbor's landscaping too. And this is something to consider when you're, extending the bed of your house, a foundation planting where you come out quite a bit further. It's a great opportunity to really work with what you have. So, seeing how fast your soils drain. What we'll do is we'll dig a coffee can size hole, maybe a little deeper. And you want to fill it up with water, let it drain once. Fill it up again, let it drain again. Third time, because what we want to do is we want to simulate a saturated condition in your soil. How fast can your soil drain when it's already full of water? And so after the third time you fill it, stick a little popsicle stick or just a stick at the top of the hole so you can measure something from there. And come back in an hour, measure how far down that water went. Come back in 2 hours maybe, measure how far down that went. Really, you want just like an even increment that you can multiply that out over 24 hours. And so here, they measured, say this is a really slow draining soil, and it only drained a 1/4 inch in 24 hours, or in 1 hour. So they'll multiply that times 24, that gives you a 6 inch deep rain garden. So even if your soil drains really slow, like I said, a 6 inch deep rain garden will usually take care of what you need, as long as you get your area to fit roughly how much water is coming to the site. So like I said, anytime you can get around 70 to 150 square feet, somewhere in there, depending on how big your house is, that's usually a great size. And so a lot of people think, oh, I have to have a flat bottom bowl in this rain garden because I want to be able to overflow the rain garden to a certain point. I want to be able to make sure the water spreads evenly across the yard. Well, they would typically think, you can't really put these on a shallow slope then. Well, really, this works out to our advantage because what we can do is we can cut out this area here and use that to pile up a berm on the overflow side. And so you can really use all that soil that you just dug on a shallow slope. And so now you have this nice flat bottom bowl, you have a berm, it's an inch lower at least than the area where the water came into, and it's really works out to be a good siting issue there. And then your first growing season, you want to limit standing water while the plants are small. So if you're noticing these things are staying full for a long time, you might want to knock down where the water normally overflows, knock down that berm just like another inch so the water will drain a little bit faster, so it'll come down a little bit in level. And I'll go a little more into actual construction here so you can kind of understand what I'm talking about here. But you want to water in that first season during the dry periods. Native plants are great, but they still need to get established. They still need to get that root system going. And so if you can water during that first season, if it's really droughty, like last fall, that was awful for most of the installations we did. So we really had to make sure to call everybody back and say, make sure you're watering these. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time next spring. But usually after that first year, unless it's a whole summer drought, they're pretty self-sufficient plants as far as watering needs. And pull weeds. You're going to have all this bare soil that all the weeds are going to want to come into. Pull weeds. And if you don't stay on top of it in the first season, you're not going to like yourself in the second season. So I can't stress that enough, because everybody says, oh, rain gardens are so low maintenance. Well, they're low water maintenance, but it's still, you have all this bare soil, there's still weeds there. So different ways to get water to your site, to your rain garden. Here you have a granite sidewalk slab with a little depression underneath where we have a garden here and a garden on the other side where they're connected underneath. This is really, again, limited by your own creativity, what you want to do with your yard. Here you can see this little slot here. It's a channel drain that collects all the water in the driveway and then shoots it into this rain garden here. Here's a dry creek bed, and maybe the whole home's downspouts will all come to this one point in the dry creek bed, and this thing will just be roaring once there's a rain event, but it'll be dry when there's no rain. And so here's an illustration of one of those channel drains in the section where the water will come down the driveway, hit this pocket that's set in a little pocket of concrete, and then that'll flow over to the rain garden there. A lot of times, instead of letting water flow off your downspout, just with your downspout flowing over grass into the rain garden, people instead prefer to bury their pipe. And so what you need is a drain box with a grate on top so the leaves and stuff don't get in there. You'll need some just 4-inch corrugated pipe and an atrium grate, which will cover up the end so the mulch doesn't back up into there when it starts to fill up. And in section, that will just run from the house, from the gutter, underground in that pipe. And a lot of times this pipe will be exposed in the side of the slope, just with the grate like you saw in this last picture right there, or they'll have what's called a pop-up emitter, and that will come in if you don't have enough grade change in your yard to get good slope out of that pipe so water will actually flow through it. You can put it under the garden to get that slope, and then once the pressure backs up enough, this thing will pop up and the water will fill the garden from underneath. And there's a million ways to do this system too, which I don't have time to get into, but a lot of times we'll want to connect under a sidewalk sometimes. And so a lot of people are like, oh, I have to rip up my sidewalk. Well, I have seen people do it this way, where they'll get a PVC plastic pipe and they'll jam a hose into the end of it, and they'll get a rubber mallet, and pretty much it's just the water eating away at the soil and the force and wrenching it through. I did it this summer for a project. It took about 20 minutes. It's a lot of elbow grease, and it's a messy job, but it works. And so you can see here they're pounding it through, and it's slowly getting through, and now you see it comes out the other side there. And a lot of times it's great because you just need to dig the trench wide enough to get your hands in there to move around. So it's not a huge disturbance. So the flat bottom bowl, this is critical. You can see here. So this is what you have to pay attention to. So the water's going to come in through this way on the right side where it says inflow, and you always want a place. So your rain garden's going to overflow at some point. We're going to get 10 inches of rain, who knows? And this isn't going to hold 10 inches of rain. So you have to account for where your water's going to overflow to. And so always making sure that you have one point in the garden that is at least an inch lower than the rest of the border of the edge of the garden. So you can think of, like a cereal bowl, and if you just put a crack in the edge of it, the milk will spill out where that crack is now, if you put a little divot there. And so you want a place where this is going to be able to overflow to, because you don't want it backing up towards your house. You don't want it backing up towards any other critical structures. And so make sure this is always, going to the downhill side, going back out to the street after that. At least you're capturing a good portion of that water in the meantime. And so to make sure this is a flat bottom bowl, you can do it two ways. You can have this little laser transit. It's really just a kind of a cheaper surveying tool, and it'll allow you to shoot a laser level and just check all your depths across the bottom. Or you can do it the old way and put two stakes in, put a line level on there with a string attached to it, and just measure down how far that is. So you want to measure, say this is 6 inches from here to here, and you want a 6-inch deep garden. Well, make sure that every point you measure along this line is 12 inches. Just add the two together. And it's fine if it varies within an inch or two, but just make sure that the bottom of the bowl is relatively flat. A lot of times we'll just eyeball it, and we'll know just from working with it so much that you can tell when it's flat. But just make sure, again, that the overflow is sited properly and it's lower than every other point in the garden. Materials for building the garden. We prefer a double shredded hardwood mulch. I know there's free mulches available like through the Minneapolis Park Board or something like that. It's a really weedy source, plus it's wood chips. Wood chips tend to float when the garden fills up, and they'll all move to one side of the garden, and you're not going to like that. So when you do a double shredded hardwood mulch, they're a little more fibery and they tend to lock together. So when you walk across your garden too, it kind of helps distribute your weight a little bit more over the garden, so you're not recompacting the soil as much as you would with a standard chip. Also, you want to re-amend your soil with some compost, something that's going to retain a little bit water for those droughty periods, and retain water for longer. Some native plants, a lot of people stress strictly native plants. Honestly, if you have a situation like this, these are not natives. This is a Karl Forester grass. That's a Russian sage. That's a gold stem black-eyed Susan. The black-eyed Susan it's a variation of a native plant, but it's a little more robust. It has a nicer, tighter form. A lot of times the native plants they want to flop quite a bit, and so I really want to stress that it's not just natives. It's limited to variations of these natives as well that work out really well. So the key is to double dig. If you want a 6-inch garden, remove 9 inches of soil first, then go down at least a shovel head deep more and turn that soil over, really decompact it. And so after you've done that, after you fluffed up that other soil, you'll be back up to roughly about that 6-inch depth that you wanted. And so then throw in your compost. Usually it's about a half a yard to a yard, depending on how bad your soils are. But about a half a yard of compost is what we would typically use for well draining soil, just as a nice amendment for organic material. And once you add that, you should be able, you turn that back over again and mix the compost with your subsoil. And so I'll show you a picture of that too in a second here. But don't go more than a foot deep. It's just really too much there for storage. But here you see he's got a sod kicker and he's kicking off the sod. He laid the line of the rough shape he wanted with like a tape measure, a garden hose. You can spray paint it in there. But then you go through the sod kicker, pull off the sod. If you want to save it for something else later, sod kickers are great because then you can roll up the sod and place it somewhere else and fill in a patch somewhere else in your yard. You're going to remove the sod, and then here they're going in, and along the edges of the sidewalk, they'll dig straight down and loosen up that whole edge. You can always rebuild that wall against the sidewalk there. Just don't go under the sidewalk. And here they dug down to the depth they want, they overdug, they turned everything over, and now they're adding the compost, and they're going to re-rotate, kind of re-till that back into the soil there. And a lot of times, you'll notice that you're recompacting the soil. So just start at one end of the garden and move your way down. If you have 2 people working on it, try to start at one end still and work your way down. Then you're not recompacting everything you just loosened up. And here's Craig. He looks like a giant against this garden. But really now he's raking the sidewalls back up. He's creating a nice shallow slope off the edge of the garden. And so usually it's, for every 1 foot of rise, you want about 3 feet of slope. And so, so this will, here you'll notice the flat bottom here, since it's such a narrow garden, it only occupies this shallow center space because most of this is just building up back to the edge of the garden. And here, Rusty is another guy who gives presentations, and he kind of wrote the book on stormwater plants. He's measuring the end here and making sure that, you know, with the waters coming off the sidewalk, that this is still higher than your overflow point. And now you'll see that it's already mulched before you plant. And what you want to do is you want to make sure the mulch is down. It's kind of counterintuitive to how you normally do a garden, but really what you want to do is you want to put the mulch down so you don't recompact the garden, essentially. And this is where that double shredded hardwood mulch comes in handy. And so then you space out your plants to how you think you're going to want them, and then you can go back in there, pull the mulch away, dig your hole, plant the plant, and pull the mulch back up next to it. Don't pull the mulch against the actual plant, because a lot of times the mulch is right against the plant stem. It tends to want to rot and retain moisture against the stem. So make sure there's a little gap between the stem and the mulch. So here's another site, and like I said, you'll notice that this one is right next to here, but there was no basement here, and it's a really well-draining soil over here. And so here they already amended the soil with, they already dug it once and then removed the soil that they needed, and then they added about 1.5 yards of compost here. Now he's going back through and remixing that through. You notice that it's not a bobcat and he's not driving through the middle of it. He's, you know, working from the edge of the garden with something that can scoop in and out without recompacting things. And so after that, after he had tilled all that up, they set the levels of the berm. They want it to overflow out this point, pretty much from this edge to this edge. So all this will be set about 1 inch lower than this edge, and this edge. So this is all your high side of the garden, and that's your lowest point right there, and of the actual edge of the garden. And everything else is 6 inches down from that berm edge. And you'll see it's, you know, quite flat here. After they raked it all over, they tamped down the berm just a tiny bit just to make sure it's secure. And then they laid down the mulch and set out the plants ready for planting. And you can see, you know, it's okay to walk in the garden, just, you know, don't have 30 people standing in it. And then watering and smiling, you need a lot of that right after you put them in. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over plant selection a little bit. So again, the Blue Thumb Guide to Rain Gardens, this is what Rusty had written, and Dan Shaw works with the Board of Water and Soil Resources. They put together this great guide as far as how to site your garden. It goes way more in depth than what I'm ever able to accomplish in 45 minutes. And it also gives you great tips on plant selection, plant palettes, whether you have a shade garden, whether you have a sunny garden. He'll give you like a starting template to work with and how you can substitute in and out from there. So it's really, we use this a lot at our other workshops where we're sitting down with homeowners individually and helping them site rain gardens. And I swear by this book. So. But you can go to bluethumb.org, Metro Blooms, we sell them too. You can find these really anywhere right now. But plant selection criteria, really look at, you know, there's a lot of factors here. You want to know how much moisture they can take. Can they be inundated with water in a pool of water for 24 hours at a time? Some plants can't handle it. Some of the prairie plants can't handle it. But some of the stuff that's on like a wetland edge, they can tolerate that water bounce. Sunshade, is it sunny, shady? How well does your soil drain? Some plants can't handle clay, some plants love sand. And then really design characteristics. Do you want stuff to bloom all season? You can think about those things. Do you want stuff that's only 3 feet in height, or do you want some really tall stuff in there too? So thinking about that. Is there certain wildlife value that you want? Do you want certain butterflies to come to your garden? Because there's certain, you know, certain blazing stars that only attract certain butterflies, which are really nice. And also purchase availability. If you're down in southern Minnesota, it's really hard to find a nursery that has all the stuff that you want. But if you're up here near the cities, there's going to be a wealth of opportunity to find what you need. And so I'll kind of cruise through this really quick, but you know, you can see blue flag iris is one of the most versatile plants we have for our rain gardens. It's a great plant, it's a great structure, and it can handle drought or wet for the most part. Purple coneflower and the black-eyed Susans, those tend to be the most common plants you'll see a lot of times because they're very versatile plants. And they're both adapted to kind of a wet meadow or a prairie, so they can handle that variability in the water. Trees and shrubs, you can even put trees in your gardens. Those actually help infiltrate even more. But you have autumn blaze maple, you have a black chokeberry. The native ones are 8 feet around. They have the shorter ones that are like 3 feet tall, the autumn magic ones. You can do river birches. You know, there are a lot of trees. There's serviceberry is one of my favorite that you can put them, and they're really great trees. And grasses, highly encourage the grasses. And if you do little blue stem, Carl Forster grass, this one is used quite a bit now, just because it's really versatile. You can put it right in the middle of the rain garden, it does great. Little blue stem likes it a little more up towards the edges though. And that's little blue stem as you grow through the season, and it gets a nice brighter color. And you can also have, there's a lot of stuff for shade too. Sedges, which are like the grass equivalent for part shade. They do like it a little more moist, but usually when it's shady, it's a little more moist. Lady fern, columbine, culver's root, which is quite a bit taller, wild geranium. A lot of these are native plants that tend to spread a little more. At least these top three do. But there are a lot of other shade plants you can still put in gardens. Hostas are very tolerant of that, and if you'd like to be a hosta gardener, they work out really well. They're very versatile. Blue lobelia and turtlehead are some of my favorites for the shade, and definitely all the sedges. I love all the different grassy textures that you can get in their low clump forming things that don't spread too aggressively. Full sun, look to the prairie plants again. Look to the coreopsis, the prairie drop seed, like the hyssops and the butterfly milkweed. And again, blazing star. This is, the butterflies can't resist the blazing star. It'll be common that you'll see 3 or 4 on the same stem. They're just crazy for it. And early sunflower, again, there's a Carl Forster. You can see it's pretty versatile because we have it in a few pictures. And other horticultural varieties, again, hostas, blueberries. If you amend your soil to be a little more acidic, you can even grow blueberries. You can grow some vegetables in your garden. Just avoid things that have tubers, because a lot of times, like carrots, things like that, they'll store a lot of those toxins in that tuber. But leafy greens, other berries that have a process to go through the rest of the plant before they actually fruit, those are okay for a lot of times growing in your garden. I still tend to stay away from them if you're taking a lot of pollutants off the street, but in your yard, there's really not much you can do to ruin the vegetable, unless it's a tuber. So here's a couple examples. I'll just go through a couple examples of other gardens real quick. But we have a gray-headed coneflower, butterfly milkweed. There's the purple coneflower, and this is just a wet meadow. This is what you normally see out in nature. But a lot of these are adapted to this wet environment that you can put into a nice sunny, semi-wet rain garden. And so really, mixing up your grasses, your flowers, and your shrubs. You want to create all-season interest. A lot of times shrubs have that nice form all winter long, something to look at. Forb is a flower. Essentially, it's really any native flower. Yep. And so mixtures of natives and cultivars. So cultivars are just varieties of those natives, or anything where you pretty much mash 2 flowers together and try to get another result, or you select for a certain growing characteristic of that flower. So in the back of that book that I showed you, the Blue Thumb Guide, you'll have templates that are kind of like this, and they'll have, here's where you can put this flower, here's where they're better in the basin versus around the edge of the garden, because on the edge of the garden it definitely is higher and drier and they don't get as much water as you would in the bottom, so you want to think about that a little bit, and that's why that Blue Thumb Guide is really handy. It's like $18 or something like that, and like I said, it's the best $18 I ever spent. But try to do things in drifts where things are really apparent that this is, you have 5 of this plant here. I know that one in the middle is not what this plant is. That's a weed. Let's pull that. And then it makes weeding a heck of a lot easier rather than the shotgun approach where you just have scattering everything everywhere. It really helps if you, well, first of all, if you don't know your plants that well, I think drift planting is a really great intuitive way to manage your garden. And so here's a couple other ones. Hard edges are your friend. They create a nice edge to your garden. And, a lot of times grass is going to want to creep in. So I do recommend using, if you're going to use edging, like on this side, if the water's coming in off the lawn, steel edging I highly recommend because it sits flush with the edge. But if that's too expensive, you still can do a vinyl edging with the knob at the top. But a lot of times if you notice the water's coming to one point to flow into your garden, cut a little notch in that knob so the water can flow past that. Because a lot of times that knob's going to be a barrier for water to get into your garden. But here's, this is one of the greatest examples of a rain garden. They took all the water from all the downspouts in the house, pumped them to one side in an underground pipe, and they flow out through the back of this boulder wall and into this garden here. And I'll show you more pictures of that here. Here's another curb cut rain garden. Actually, I guess we're going to come back to that. I guess the slide's a little further down. So, here's just a couple project profiles. Here's the Bloomington one where you can see the Carl Forster grass and some purple dome aster in there and some sedums. Sedums work really great around the edge. It tends to be a favorite. Be careful with the daylilies because they're going to take over your garden. But if you are on top of your gardening, they're usually not a problem. Purple dome aster is a favorite of mine. They're a great clump former. Same with the sedum. And here's one where, they had their foundation planting here. And so what they did was they extended, they extended the garden out this way. And so you can see, we're looking at it from the other angle now. You can see they extended this out here, dug their 6 to 9 inch bowl here, and the water's going to flow in and fill up right through there. And then it's going to it'll soak in and then it'll overflow out over the edge of the berm. And then so they really went overboard and put this berm erosion control mat over the edge of it. You usually don't have to do that, but this is the way they wanted to do it, and they just planted through that mat. But there they have a bunch of blue flag iris and some other plants there, and they still have their old juniper there. But this is it's a really easy way to integrate what you have. You can also do rain barrels to capture and then feed some of the water too if you don't have enough room for a rain garden. But this is something we usually get into more in our longer workshops where we can really explore these other stormwater runoff possibilities. So here's another one. Here's a nice dry creek bed down a hillside that flows into this depression at the bottom. Again, it's just limited by your site and your creativity, whatever you want to do with it. As long as the water flows downhill, it doesn't care where it goes. Here they cut a little notch across the pavers, and that flows all the way from the neighbor's house down this hill and into this larger garden here. And it also flows down this paver area and stops there and goes right into there. So it redirects into this larger area. This one's one of my favorites. This is just an area that had, it had some issues there, and they had water backing up into the foundation because it was sloped the wrong way. And so what they did, they just dug a nice long trench here and actually put a little bridge over it so the water connects from here to here. And that's what it comes out like. I really like just the mailman path that runs through there, and you still have the access to the street, and you still have this great planting that forms a nice edge to the yard. And this one, they just put some limestone cobbles along the edge, and catmint is a great one for that high and dry spot, and then with a bunch of coneflowers behind it. So the rain garden is actually hidden in there, but you can't really see it too well. But it overflows out that way to the sidewalk in the back to the street if ever has to fill up. But again, we're back to that other one where she took all the neighbors' homes were flowing to this area. So they put a backyard rain garden in here, had that, and all the downspouts went to this backyard rain garden. But when that filled, which it always did, was made to overflow a lot, they sent a pipe down this side and out to this front area where you're going to see that sidewalk rain garden. So you can see the backyard ones filling up here and going out to the front of the yard. And so that's what it was before, and that's what it was after. So you can see there's quite a bit of, they just knocked out that whole slope and put a boulder wall on the back of it, and the pipes come out of the wall there, and they fill this up. This is a pretty shallow garden, but like I said, most of the infiltration happens in the backyard, and this is really for overflow. But that's one of my favorite ones. So here's year 1, there's year 2, and there's year 3. So it gets to be a pretty full garden. And some of these, it's such a healthy garden that, they didn't anticipate these grasses getting so, they're way taller than what you normally expect. So they're kind of going everywhere now. But, a lot of times, if you don't have this nutrient-rich garden, they'll be a little more, stable. But again, Metro Blooms, we offer design services for anybody who has questions about this. We'll make planting plans. We'll give you a plant palette. We'll give you notes, what are specific to your site. But it requires us coming out to your site, looking at it for about an hour, and then we'll go back and we'll create a design for you if you want a design, and we'll send that back out to you. And any installation assistance as far as recommendations, things like that, we're always there for. Here's another one where we just do a drift planting scheme and give you the plants there. And he even had a little section here just with your depth and what you need. But that is it.
Great. What is the average cost of a rain garden? What would you charge for design, and what would the average cost of
Average cost varies quite a bit. It really depends on what you want. I've seen some people get them as cheap as, if you want to dig the garden yourself and then also install all the plants, you can get it down to $300 to $500 with materials if you just buy native plugs. But if you want larger stock to go in the ground, if you want larger boulders, things like that, if you need pipes, these, and you have a contractor come out and do it, they're easily going $1,500 to $2,500. So it's for just an average size rain garden. But so like I said, the price fluctuates quite a bit. But if you're a do-it-yourself kind of guy and you're able to dig the hole, you can cut down that cost quite a bit. Yeah, you potentially could, but but you'd have to know where all the water's flowing in order to size that appropriately, though. But yeah, yep. Thank you.